To the $10 million question, what were they protesting? This is a question I tend to be pretty cautious about when it comes to large-scale protest movements, not just in Canada, but in other countries too. I visited Santiago a few years ago when they were in the midst of a very intense protest movement of their own, and in the ensuing video I made, I tried to emphasize how these protests weren't really about a single thing per se, but rather a sort of broader expression of left-wing malaise towards the perceived corruption and indifference of the Chilean system more broadly. I think the Canadian truckers' protest is best thought of in a similar way. It is perhaps best understood as a movement of broad right-wing malaise towards the perceived oppressions that Canada's governments have imposed on the public during the COVID-19 pandemic. In theory, the spark that triggered everything was Prime Minister Trudeau's decision in early January to require all truckers returning to Canada from the US to be fully vaccinated.
Truckers will have to be fully vaccinated to enter Canada.
Come Saturday, new rules mean unvaccinated truckers entering Canada will be subject to testing and quarantine.
Everyone, every trucker entering into Canada or every Canadian or American trucker transiting to Canada must be vaccinated.
The tighter restrictions put an estimated 10,000 truckers off the road, but the actual number is likely much higher.
Prior to that, truckers had been exempt from the vaccine mandates because they were considered an essential service, and the Trudeau decision was accordingly quite unpopular with the trucking industry.
Unvaccinated drivers have been delivering loads since March of 2020 because as essential workers they've always been able to go.
But that said, it quickly became clear that the vaccine mandate was really just the pretext for a much more wide-scale protest against the idea of COVID restrictions more broadly. A manifesto posted on the Freedom Convoy Facebook page and signed by the two people usually described as the ringleaders of the protest listed 4 key demands: an end to vaccine passports and all other obligatory vaccine contract tracing programs, an end to vaccine mandates, cease the divisive rhetoric attacking Canadians who disagree with government mandates, and cease to limit debate through coercive measures with the goal of censoring those who have varying or incorrect opinions. Or, as a fellow in a viral video summed it up,
the honking will continue until freedom improves. Simple as that.
From the start, the truckers singled out Prime Minister Trudeau as their main enemy, with Trudeau flags a particularly ubiquitous presence. This gave the protests a pretty partisan tint, but it also made them an important symbol of the broader drift of right-wing politics into a more populist direction, as explained in this quote from Rich Lowry, who's a famous American political commentator. The sense now is less, the government is bankrupting us, and more, these out-of-touch, self-appointed experts are telling us what to do because they have too much power and like lording it over us, with the press, social media, corporations, and nonprofits all on their side. Because it was such a large protest, however, there were other factions and other arguments being made as well, embodying other strains of right-wing thought, a particularly prominent one being conspiracism. People sometimes ask me if there are any uniquely popular conspiracy theories in Canada, and I usually reply by calling attention to the so-called sovereign citizen type stuff, which is when people put forward these theories that because, the Canadian Constitution was signed the wrong way in 1921 or whatever, all of our laws are actually illegitimate, and the government doesn't actually have any power to arrest you if you break one of their phony laws and so forth. Early on in the protest, there was a petition circulated by a certain faction of the truckers and signed by over 320,000 online supporters that offered a fairly bizarre interpretation of the Canadian political system in which the Canadian Senate and Governor General were called on to assert powers they do not have and create a weird new interim government for Canada that would then repeal all of the COVID restrictions. The Governor General, in particular, who is the representative of the British Queen in Canada, became a particular subject of fascination by this set and was bombarded around the clock with demands to fire Prime Minister Trudeau. This is also not remotely within her authority to do, but crazy theories about the power of the Crown often play a prominent role in Canadian conspiracy theories of this flavor. Now, regardless of how persuasive or not you find any of this stuff, in many ways, the much more significant thing about the truckers' protest was just that it involved truckers. Leaving aside the question of how representative a convoy of a few hundred trucks was of the interests or opinions of Canadian truckers in general, who are a huge and diverse community, the most relevant variable explaining why it had the impact that it did was just that it used trucks. Parking gigantic trucks in a city's downtown core in a fashion designed to cause maximum obstruction and frustration was undeniably an extremely creative and unprecedented tactic that proved remarkably effective, at least in the short term. On February 7th, the CBC published a good piece that described in considerable detail how towing a giant truck is difficult or almost impossible without the driver's cooperation, and even harder still when the tow truck companies themselves are refusing to offer their services out of solidarity or fear.
Several independent contractors and companies have publicly supported the convoy and are refusing to tow trucks in the protest. Those who have offered assistance are being threatened.
We could very easily make a whole other video just analyzing the power of the protest from this sort of technological, logistical perspective, but I think it is probably a pretty underrated angle of their success overall. So what gave the truckers such an innovative idea? Some pundits, such as David Frum, the famed Canadian-American political commentator, has speculated about this a fair bit, and I think his argument is pretty persuasive.
The prelude to a lot of what happened in Ottawa was a year and a half where through 2020 there were increasingly intimidating acts of interruption of essential services, pipelines and rail by other kinds of protesters farther from urban Canada. And the federal government of Justin Trudeau, largely looked the other way. And that set the table for what has happened here.
What he is describing is something that I am very intimately familiar with, living here in the province of British Columbia, which has been the site of enormous anti-oil and anti-gas activism over the last few years. Even during the trucker protest itself, there was a fairly violent protest in the northern part of this province at a natural gas site where mass protesters smashed up a bunch of property in an effort to disrupt the project. So the conclusion would be that there has been a slow normalization in Canada of the politics of, I guess we would call it like physicality, for lack of a better term. The idea of using physical blockades and physical obstruction and even physical destruction as a means in which a minority faction can get their political views across. And as Frum alluded to, there's also a kind of jealous both sidesism going on, wherein the Canadian right perceives the left as having gotten away with these sorts of tactics for too long and are now willing to call the government's bluff by using them themselves. All right, so now let us talk a little bit more about the whole partisan angle to this thing. The angle of the truckers' protest as a symbol of the poisonous polarization of left versus right politics that is becoming so ubiquitous everywhere these days. I wrote a few columns about the protests in my capacity as a columnist at the Washington Post. And in this one, I talked a lot about the degree that the truckers had a uniquely traumatizing effect on people on the Canadian left or even center because of the way they embodied such a galling rejection of what had previously been assumed to be pretty solid public support for Canada's COVID policies. As I put it, a festival of partisan division and anti-government bombast in the nation's capital is a painful unraveling of presumed consensus when the country's politicians and journalists have leaned so heavily on confident rhetoric of cooperation and unity to get through the pandemic. Canadian COVID policies have not been the strictest in the world by any stretch, but they have been fairly uniform across the country, with basically every province having a similar regime of mandatory masking and vaccine passports and targeted shutdowns, regardless of what party was in charge. There was likewise a lot of coverage in the Canadian press that presented such policies as not only broadly popular, but patriotic, easy, and natural for Canadians to follow, because Canadians supposedly are just inherently passive people who love doing what they're told. The line I will always remember was from this 2020 editorial from the Toronto Star, Canada's biggest newspaper, declaring, "At core, our national DNA favors the collective during a crisis that has demanded collective action, mutual sacrifice, looking out for the other, rather than insistence on personal liberty and pursuit of happiness." At one time, this sort of thing was being published everywhere, alongside plenty of America bashing, which of course is always hard to escape in this country. The idea being that while Americans were acting like wild yahoos, screaming about freedom and refusing to wear masks, Canadians were obediently whipping out their vaccine passports to visit their local library or whatever. But then the truckers happened, and suddenly a lot of progressive Canadians were aggressively reminded that this country does indeed contain plenty of people flamboyantly opposed to vaccine mandates and all the rest of it. Liberal columnists accordingly went from praising our national DNA to writing morose things like,